Tanks and armoured vehicles have taken a beating in the war in Ukraine. Thanks to FPV drone attacks coming from both sides, Russia and Ukraine have both reduced the use of tanks and armoured vehicles from the eastern Ukraine front lines in the summer of 2025. Russia, in particular, has been rapidly withdrawing its expensive and rapidly depleting armour from the front lines, opting instead for offensive tactics using small groups of infantry rather than columns of armour. But as the cold, rainy season, or so-called Rasputitsa, sets in, the use of protective armour is becoming necessary again. And given the latest video emerging from the front, protection from the elements is the least of the concerns. In a shocking report from Zaporizhzhia, Ukrainian forces stopped a Russian armoured assault vehicle in its tracks. But before they could capture the surrendering elite Russian troops who'd survived the attack, Russian FPV drones appeared on the scene and reportedly took out their own troops. It's a blow not only to Russia's limited supply of armoured vehicles, but their equally limited supply of troops. First, setting the scene. According to a report published by pro-Ukrainian military blogger reporting from Ukraine, the debacle occurred on the approach to the settlement of Mala Tokmachka, a narrow, elongated village on the outskirts of the town of Orikhiv. Orikhiv is a key node in Ukraine's defensive line across southern eastern Zaporizhzhia, one of the most heavily fortified sectors between Russian-occupied territory and the city of Zaporizhzhia itself. It's a vital position for both sides, particularly as winter approaches. Neither side wants to be in icy dugouts outside the city, as opposed to the relative comforts of buildings inside the city, when General Frost inevitably makes his arrival. The same is of course true for every contested town and village across the front lines, but Orikhiv and its surroundings stand out on the map as a key target both for the Russians to take and the Ukrainians to hold on to for dear life. Russia's Zaporizhzhia's offensive of 2025 has focused on three main trajectories. First, they've been trying to advance north towards the city of Zaporizhzhia from the vicinity of Kamianske in the Russian-occupied part of the oblast. But after some initial successes, including the capture of the settlement of Plavny, they'd be more or less bogged down on the outskirts of Stepnohirsk for months. The second main direction of the Russian offensive has been towards the other major Ukrainian stronghold in eastern Zaporizhzhia, the small city of Hulyai-Pole. Here, they've ground their way into the Ukrainian fortifications to the east of Hulyai-Pole, taking some, if not all, of Poltavka and Malinivka in bloody battles. But they're still a long way from their main target. The third main direction is Orikhiv. The problem for the Russians here is that to both the east and west of Orikhiv are some of the densest Ukrainian defensive lines outside of Donetsk. There are no low-risk options available to approach it, which is why Russia seems to have decided that the direct line through heavily fortified Mala Tokmachka is probably the best card in a losing hand. However, Ukraine has successfully, and with relative comfort, kept Russian advances in this critical direction at bay throughout the summer. The best the Russians could do was manage to take Pokrovsk and reach within touching distance of Mala Tokmachka earlier in October. Now, the defences here are practically impenetrable without the use of armoured vehicles to bring infantry close enough to the Ukrainian positions to try and dislodge them. So, the Russians attempted an old-school assault using waves of armoured vehicles. Inside the vehicles, according to the report, were elite Russian units from the VDV, the Russian Airborne Forces. From the Russian perspective, to call what happened next a disaster would be a major understatement. Of the 26 armoured vehicles and tanks that attacked, 22 were destroyed by Ukraine during the course of the day. The attack seems to have taken place in waves rather than all at once. The geolocated footage provided in the report is of poor quality, so it's difficult to tell exactly what's going on. But in the segments provided, several units of burning and wrecked Russian armour can be clearly seen. Also visible are at least 2 Russian soldiers seen surrendering to Ukrainian forces. And this is where the story gets nasty. According to the report, the Russian troops who survived the destruction of the armoured vehicles and tanks were travelling in scattered groups in the fields. Some of them seem to have taken up basic defensive positions without much cover and with no support. Most were simply picked off by Ukrainian kamikaze FPV drones, with a few who remained opting to put discretion before valor and surrender while they still had the chance. But according to the report, before they could be captured, Russian kamikaze drones arrived on the scene and finished off their own troops. Very grainy footage appears to show one such soldier emerging from his position with hands aloft. He's being guided toward the Ukrainian rear areas by 2 Ukrainian soldiers who accepted his surrender and took him as a prisoner of war. Then, an equally grainy still image purports to show the drone attacking not the Ukrainian soldiers, but the Russians. It's not clear from the image whether the drone dropped an explosive onto him or flew into him, both of course being typical methods by which FPV drones kill people. Unfortunately, the image is just too blurry to tell. However, this is the second report of a Russian drone killing one of their own, attempting to surrender in the Zaporizhzhia direction in the past week. On October 22, the defense forces of southern Ukraine shared a video on Telegram that they say shows the same situation occurring, this time in Stepnohirsk. The video is much clearer than the one from Mala Tokmachka. A Russian soldier is seen, who certainly seems to be surrendering, but is clearly worried about a drone overhead. The drone then drops an explosive on him. The Ukrainian source said that the soldier had realized the hopelessness of continuing to fight and was putting down his weapon when a Russian drone dropped explosives on him, killing him instantly. The Ukrainian command said that instead of allowing his servicemen to survive, the operator of the enemy drone dropped an explosive device on him, instantly ending the life of the soldier who was trying to surrender. The post added that this incident is further evidence that the enemy does not value the lives of even its own soldiers and is ready for cruel actions to hide the manifestations of unwillingness to fight among its personnel. From the footage alone, skeptics might well ask how it's known it was, in fact, a Russian drone that took out the Russian soldier, and not a Ukrainian drone. It's impossible to tell just from the shared footage. The same is true of the video and stills shared from the failed Russian assault on Mala Tokmachka. Nonetheless, the report makes the same point. The incident shows just how little the enemy's command cares about the lives of its troops. And in this case, it's not just any old disposable troops being deliberately taken out by friendly fire. It's supposedly some of Russia's most elite fighting forces. The VDV is a rapid response force and strategic reserve within the Russian armed forces, established in 1992 following the dissolution of the Soviet Union. They're an independent combat arm that reports directly to the Chief of the General Staff, currently Valery Gerasimov, and fall under the supreme command of President Vladimir Putin. The VDV are known by several nicknames, including Blue Berets, Winged Infantry, Troops of Uncle Vasya, and Angels of Death. Their motto is "Nobody but us." The Blue Berets nickname refers to their trademark Ultramarine Berets. They're sometimes compared to the US Marines due to their elite status and political influence. However, in terms of their operational doctrine and structure, they're much more closely aligned with NATO airborne forces, such as the US 82nd Airborne, France's 11th Parachute Brigade, or Germany's Fallschirmjäger. Similar to these NATO forces, the VDV are organized into airborne and air assault units, with a structure that includes divisions, brigades, and regiments at various operational levels. By 2024, the force had grown to around 60,000 personnel following Russia's special military operation in Ukraine. Fully mechanized, it employs specialized airborne vehicles like the BMD series, offering superior firepower to many similar forces. The force includes elite units such as the 45th Guards Spetsnaz Brigade and the 11th Guards Airborne Brigade, and maintains training institutions like the Ryazan Guards Higher Airborne Command School, the VDV's Primary Officer Academy, and the Ulyanovsk Guards Suvorov Military School, which trains younger cadets. Their mission includes conducting independent operations or supporting larger army groups, and serving as a high readiness force for crisis response or strategic strikes. During the war, like so much else on both sides, their role has evolved. They've gone from traditional airborne assaults to include air mobile and mechanized infantry operations, and of course, the introduction of drone units, obligatory on today's battlefield in Ukraine. As such, they're considered to be a key instrument in the Russian General Staff's strategic toolkit, valued for their high readiness, mobility, and elite training, enabling them to respond swiftly to regional crises or conduct operations behind enemy lines. Well, at least that's the theory. In practice, needs change, and Russia has been forced to use them in far less than ideal roles. As far back as Ukraine's counter-offensive of 2023, Russia was already turning to its elite paratroopers to help defend against Ukraine's battlefield advances as a kind of regular infantry. War analysts at the time were already speculating that the VDV, reeling from past setbacks and failures, and battered and bruised from combat, might now be airborne in name only. At the time, then Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu claimed that several actions were being taken to increase the combat potential of the VDV, such as the creation of new airborne assault units. Additionally, he said, Moscow would be adding support, repair, recovery and artillery capabilities to all divisions of the VDV, as well as new weapons and equipment. According to the Institute for the Study of War, these additional units, if indeed implemented, will likely allow the Russian military to use Russian VDV divisions almost interchangeably with motorized rifle divisions in the future, and VDV elements in Ukraine have been increasingly operating as combat infantry similar to motorized rifle divisions. But 2 years on, in the fields outside Orikhiv, it looks like that might just be a lofty way of saying the VDV has been converted into more meat for the meat grinder, and that they're fair game for Russian drones if they dare to surrender. So how can it be certain that the footage in the reporting from the Ukraine report definitively shows VDV forces being taken out by Ukrainian and/or Russian drones in the Ukrainian drones? It's frankly impossible to tell from the provided footage. It's just too grainy. But there are a few hints. First, those could well be the distinctive ultramarine berets on their heads. Now, other prominent Russian forces involved in Ukraine wear a similar color. The naval infantry or marines wear black berets, the interior troops berets are maroon, and the FSB border service wear green. Second, it's known that VDV forces are operating in the area. Recent frontline reports from the Russian side reveal that elements of the 7th VDV Division, including drone operators from the 108th Airborne Regiment, are conducting strikes near Primorske and Stepnohirsk in the Zaporizhzhia direction. Some of the units that were dispatched from the Sumy region to Pokrovsk in September may also have been redirected towards Orikhiv, at least if any of them are still alive. Ukrainian command claims that 14,000 Russian soldiers have been killed or wounded in the Pokrovsk area alone since late August, claims that haven't been independently verified. Put all the evidence together and it does seem rather plausible that the footage does indeed show elite VDV paratroopers being thrown into the meat grinder, and if the claims of them being taken out by their own drones are true, they only add to a growing set of evidence presented by Ukraine that such punitive measures have been adopted by the Russian officers to prevent mass capitulation. As the report states, if the Russian command tolerates increasing numbers of surrendering soldiers, discipline will collapse further, and desertion and refusal will spread, leading to uncontrollable manpower losses. To prevent this, the officers tried to re-establish deterrence through public and private punishment, but at a steep cost. Taking out surrendering soldiers may slow the spread of capitulation, but they also indicate to recruits that officers care little for their survival. Potential volunteers or contract recruits watching these developments would be less likely to sign up, creating longer-term recruitment and readiness problems for an army that Ukraine and the Western media insist has been devastated by huge losses. Apparently, in addition to sustaining huge amounts of casualties, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky this week claimed the number of Russian casualties has risen to over 1.3 million. Russian desertion numbers are also growing fast. Based on a screenshot of a slide alleged to have leaked from an internal Russian presentation, Ukrainian military analyst Frontelligence extrapolated in March that the overall number of documented Russian AWOL cases had grown to 50,554 since the beginning of Russia's invasion. These numbers are validated to an extent by Russian court records, which show that over 20,000 criminal cases related to desertion, unauthorized absence, and disobedience were processed between late 2023 and May 2025. Reports indicate a sharp rise in such cases in 2024 and 2025, with some estimates projecting up to 70,000 desertions in 2025 alone, potentially affecting 10% of Russian forces deployed in Ukraine. On September 17, Putin told a meeting of parliamentary factions that some 700,000 Russian troops were deployed in Ukraine. So, what's driving the increasing number of desertions? Russia has strict penalties for desertion, including up to 15 years in prison for desertion, or it appears death by Russian kamikaze drone. Factors include heavy casualties, poor leadership, harsh conditions in penal Stormzy units, and growing disillusionment. Human rights group Get Lost has reportedly assisted between 26,000 and 48,000 Russians in trying to avoid or escape military service. However, as dire as this situation appears to be for Russia, Ukraine has its own much larger problem with desertion and unauthorized abandonment of positions itself. In response to an inquiry by Ukrainian news portal Ukrainian Truth, the Ukrainian Prosecutor General's office revealed a few weeks back that Ukrainian law enforcement officers had opened almost 290,000 criminal cases for unauthorized abandonment of a military unit and desertion from January 2022 to September 2025. More than 235,600 cases were for going AWOL, with 53,954 for desertion. The number of cases has reportedly also surged in 2025, with sources like German newspaper Berliner Zeitung indicating that over the past year, twice as many soldiers have deserted as during the first 2.5 years of the war. Some 29,000 soldiers have returned to their posts following the Ukrainian government's implementation of a simplified return-to-post process without prosecution, but they still seem to be leaving at a far greater rate than they're returning. The reasons cited for these massive figures are similar to those cited for Russia's high and growing desertion rates: fatigue, insufficient training, unclear terms of service, frustration, shortages, low pay, corruption, and weak military leadership or serious distrust of commanders whose orders often lead to heavy losses. Ukraine's problems with mustering up sufficient manpower to not just defend the front lines, but push Russia back have been well publicized. The desertions only add to its problematic mobilization efforts. In January, the Kyiv Independent reported that nearly 6 million Ukrainian men had not updated their information in military enlistment centers, and that most of them likely don't have grounds for a deferment or exemption. This suggests that a large number may be avoiding contact with authorities to evade mobilization. Add public resistance to mobilization and Ukraine's reluctance to conscript under 25s to the mix, and the desertion problem becomes even more acute, especially since Ukrainian forces are already outnumbered. In September, Oleksandr Syrsky, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, stated that Russia outnumbers Ukrainian forces 3-1 overall, and on the main fronts by 4 to 6 times. If Russia has 700,000 troops on the front lines, that implies Ukraine has roughly 290,000 active personnel currently engaged in combat. So, both sides are making a big deal about the other's desertions, and what it says about their tactics and lack of concern for the fate of frontline soldiers. In fact, if analysing the differing accounts of what's happening in the war generally, one might get the impression that they're observing two entirely different conflicts. Gerasimov told Putin on October 26 that up to 5,000 Ukrainian troops were encircled near Kupiansk and up to 5,500 in and around Pokrovsk. Russian-aligned mappers seem to validate at least the territorial claims. Zelensky called the claims a complete lie and not the first. Mappers like Deep State and the Institute for the Study of War agree, painting a very different picture. It's a similar story around Mala Tokmachka, where the Russians claim to have established a foothold in the town, from where a bridgehead into Orikhiv can be developed. If that's true, perhaps it's as a result of the 4 armoured vehicles that weren't destroyed by Ukrainian forces in our featured report. Perhaps they managed to land some VDV troops, who were then able to secure some positions in the town. But Ukraine denies there's any Russian presence there, and if Kyiv's assessment is correct, it only underscores just how badly the Russian offensive in Zaporizhzhia is faltering. Moscow's forces have thrown elite paratroopers, armor, and even their own drones into the fight, only to lose them all in the same fields they hope to capture. It's another sign that Russia's so-called elite forces are being ground down piece by piece by their own chaos. Now, learn more about how Ukraine's forces are turning the tide in Donetsk, breaking through Russian defenses and reclaiming key villages in this video. And make sure to subscribe to our channel too, to be among the first to find out about the latest breaking news and big developments from the Russia-Ukraine war.